With the invention of today's guest, will Nintendo finally be able to beat back the angry hordes demanding a localization of Mother 3?
I'm Mac Fraser.
I'm Backrolls.
And we're the Nintendo Nerds.
We're a comedy and gaming duo here to help you craft and play your way to a better day.
We met in the not-too-distant past during some spirited online Mario Kart, and as it turns out, we share love for art, gaming, and all things Nintendo.
And we want to share that nerdy knowledge with you.
So stick around, because in today's video, we are joined by Paul Decarlo of Microsoft. Thanks for joining us today, Paul.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. So, Paul, we met because of our previous interview with Chloe Condon, another developer advocate at Microsoft who shares a lot of the same retro Nintendo love. So when she told us about your amazing retro video game tablet that uses Microsoft Azure technology to live translate games onto a second screen, we knew we had to have you on to talk about it. So we're very grateful that you could spend this time with us. Before we dig into your technology, we'd like to know a little bit more about you. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about your journey, what brings you to your role as a developer advocate at Microsoft today?
Well, I've been in a similar type role. So our developer advocate team is actually relatively new, probably 2 years old. Although I've been in how do I describe this, a precursor team for about 6 years that sort of led up to this spiritual successor that we see in the current team. And how I got involved with that is interesting. There's a number of ways I could tell the story, but I'll try to keep it short. There was a technology evangelist from Microsoft. That's what we used to call ourselves, by the way, before Cloud Advocate. I kind of want to sometimes go back to that because, like, that is a powerful title.
It sounds so grand.
I mean, it was one of those things where, like, you hand the business card to somebody and it would, like, always strike a conversation.
Oh, evangelist. Yes, tell me more about this very serious position.
But what it entailed was this guy, Jared Benz, out here while I was going to school at the University of Houston, showed up, and he would basically just talk to us about building applications for, at the time, Windows Phone. And that seemed like a really interesting kind of job to have, to, I guess, tour around with college students and inspire them and sort of teach them how to get started on what, at the time, was still a very emerging platform. I think we were in the midst of that iPhone being like the large go-to device that consumers were after. Microsoft had its Play at the time, and so developing mobile apps was just a really cool thing. So I thought it was awesome that not only this person got to go to cool venues to talk about that, but I thought that what he was talking about was cool. Unfortunately, rest in peace, Windows Phone. But
I had one of those, believe it or
not. So as you know how that story ended up, but when I met Jared and saw what he was doing, I actually kind of, for lack of a better term, started puppy dogging and following him around to his various venues around the city, because he would go to these user groups and meetups and talk about things there. And again, I just thought that was icing on the cake. I was like, wow, so like you even get to go to these cool places where developers are getting together to talk about cool technology. And this was at a time when I don't think this has changed, but I was really discovering that I was very, very hungry for technical knowledge in any capacity. So being able to go into those environments and be able to share my enthusiasm, but also be able to learn from others was very, very powerful.
Absolutely. The hive mind is powerful these days, and being able to hang out with people who share those same passions, it inspires you, and it kind of makes the snowball roll down the hill faster.
I definitely would agree with you on that 100%. And I guess the way it ended up was, I did my time for about a year or two, and in that process, Jared kind of became a sensei of sorts, if you will, because I was that guy that would ask him, hey, how do I build this type of app? And he wouldn't build it for me. He would kind of start me down the road of, here's these technologies that I think you could look into to accomplish that. And at the time, it was a music video based application I was looking to do. And he just really kind of like set me off on this path where I could do things on my own. And when I went in for the interview, it was funny. The guy who interviewed me at the time said, we knew we were going to hire you like within the first 30 minutes. We kept you for the whole day because we had to, but I was just ready for it. I'd been doing part of the role just by shadowing my friend, and we're still friends to this day. So that's what brought me there. And I love this kind of work. It is just very fulfilling to be able to be that person that's going out there. And sometimes now I'm the person sharing the knowledge. Used to be me. I was the attendee in the room, and a lot of times now I'm the presenter. And it's just a really cool way to kind of share my passion and enthusiasm with a bunch of other people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we asked you if you happen to have any other Nintendo technology you'd been working on besides the retro gaming translation tablet, you delivered in spades. You've been working on retro gaming projects for a while now, ranging all over the place. You've connected Xbox Connect to classic Nintendo, you've made some Raspberry Pi technology, and Nintendo Windows emulators. You have been doing it all, it seems. And a lot of it seems to be in the interest of making classic games more accessible. Is this a conscious choice that you're making?
I think that it's definitely something to make it more accessible. Yes, absolutely. It's something that when I started, I guess, tinkering with projects that really interacted with real video game hardware, the first one was this connecting the Xbox One Connect to a Nintendo Entertainment System. And the idea there was like, hey, we've got this really cool way to control games with the Connect V2. Wouldn't it be awesome if we tried to see how that works or translates to a real platform, a real classic gaming platform? And what I found really interesting about that is some of the feedback that I got on it, on that particular one, was that it could enable a lot of disabled individuals to be able to play games that they may not have ever had access to because the control mechanisms just didn't really afford them that capability. Mm-hmm. And I think that was one of the first things that kind of got me thinking that there's wider usage for these types of hacks, if you will, that I've kind of put together for these various consoles. And when I look at some of the other stuff that I've done since then, for example, I know I worked with Andrew Peterson, who did a three-dimensional NES simulator, and we ported that to the HoloLens. And it just kind of created this sort of situation that people had never really seen before, like being able to walk around 3D models of the characters in Super Mario Brothers, for example, or my favorite, being able to stand over the green pipes and look inside of them in their 8-bit glory.
I'd love to do that personally. Yeah, sign me up.
Yeah.
It's an interesting experience, and what's crazy too is even in the game, I guess the way that the textures are layered, you can see the plant monster's mouth, the piranha plant, opening and closing. You can just see the tips of it. Tiles touching each other when you're looking into it. It's just a really that I guess you couldn't have really any other way. And since then, I think a lot of this stuff has kind of gone in that same tradition. So we're looking at things like using the 3DS to into an Xbox One or a HoloLens. Again, it's just you always think you should always interact with the Nintendo console in a specific way, but what if we're doing something like using an Xbox One controller and actually playing our game through an Xbox One console itself? That just becomes very surreal, almost pushing the envelope.
Absolutely. And pushing the envelope across the board, and it seems like opening up new avenues seems to be your wheelhouse right now. And it seems like this is a really interesting time to be working on that sort of thing, because there's so many practical applications to what you're doing here. And in the meantime, a lot of these historic games are being put up behind a paywall, or sometimes behind an impermeable wall where nobody can play these games. Like Super Mario Brothers is accessible to everybody, but there's an interesting conversation that we want to have a more in-depth conversation on. We're doing our own research on that and planning an in-depth conversation, but we'd love to hear your thoughts about a lot of the retro games that we're losing to history too, and a lot of these companies are kind of putting these games up behind a wall and then we're losing them forever.
So I can speak to that. based on one thing I think that's important to reveal here is I'm actually a very avid video game collector. I've got 16 game consoles connected to a CRT TV room in the house at any given time, and that's anything. If I want to play PC Engine or 3DO, Sega CD, just take the game and go. And for me, that's great. I've got this nice ability to sort of preserve things in their natural state. But when I think about games that other people could be playing, especially from those generations, I think maybe it's part of the accessibility, for bringing, I guess, the classic NES to, say, being controlled with the Kinect. One of the interesting things about that is it makes those classic games of interest to people who may not be looking back that far. For example, we've got some people that are playing games every day that were not born in that generation, so they don't know that these things exist. And it's really interesting that when you can sort of marry that up with something modern, it sort of gets people's attention, whether that's in a good way or whether it's just in an interesting way because they want to try something in a new modality. But it is also, we start to see over time, that some games are becoming less accessible, a lot due to licensing issues.
Exactly.
One of the big ones that I'm looking at right now is like the PC Engine. I believe all the rights for TurboGrafx and PC Engine were picked up by Konami, and they're doing some awesome work by re-releasing, an upcoming miniature console and all that sort of thing. But it's not going to be the full library because there's certain things that sort of limit what you can release.
Exactly. I think these mini consoles were a great monetization idea, but they do get into kind of the root of that problem where it's like when they buy all of the games, nobody's really interested in playing like Booger Man 2. But there's an argument to be made that Booger Man 2 is important to gaming history.
I couldn't agree more. And it's so funny too because these consoles come out and then usually the first thing you see is how can we play games that were not shipped with the original console. So those usually become homebrew types of projects that sort of appear in the open source world. You've seen that, I'm sure, with like the NES Mini and the SNES Mini. And so I think that those things will happen, but something about being able to know where these things came from and why some of these games behave the way they did because of perhaps hardware limitations at the time or perhaps ways that they implemented things that you just couldn't do at the time that you can do today.
So let's get into what we are here for today. Your retro translation game tablet that uses cognitive services to live translate retro games. You said that this idea came from a journey to Japan?
Yeah, I fortunately, thanks to my job, I was able to get a 3-day layover in Japan, and I'll tell you guys, it is everything they describe it as being, and maybe a little bit more. It actually kind of affected my dreams, I think, a little bit when I came back. It is actually that vast. The gaming culture is what I'm kind of referring to here. When you see it in person, it's just fantastic. And I think there's a great segue from what we were just talking about with regards to accessibility of games. So specifically when you're looking at your Nintendo consoles and PC Engine, those things are completely different, if you will, as you would expect in Japan, but they're different in every way. As in, there's more of everything. There's so many more games, and in fact, some of the games you can still find if you're like going to a secondhand bookstore or something like that. It's not like in the US where you might see a few games tucked away in a little corner, or you go to the Goodwill and they're in the case and there's maybe 5 or 6 of them there. You'll have a whole section dedicated to these types of titles. And it becomes really interesting because I'd known for a while, just being an enthusiast of import gaming for a while, that the best games have never made it to our neck of the woods. They have not jumped over from overseas to here. And there's, in some cases, only one really good way to play some of those. I know emulation gets us so far, but a lot of these things can only really be experienced on physical hardware. If we look at things like Sega Saturn, where emulation is not perfect. 2019, it's just not. There's games out there that the only way to play them is to get your hands on the import copy and then get yourself a physical piece of hardware from that country and navigate through all the menus and all that, and everything's going to be foreign, including the games oftentimes. And so when I went there, in my typical behavior of being a game collector, I came back with a whole bunch of import games, and I knew this going in. I knew I would come home with some that might not be playable, especially for a console that I was particularly hunting for, which is the PCFX, which is the PC Engine in Japan. And I didn't know what to expect with this thing. I knew that there's maybe a handful of titles, like 64 titles total, and that maybe 6 are playable without needing to know Japanese in some fashion. So when I came home and I went through the process of playing most of my games, then I started thinking about how it's just with this advent of artificial intelligence and some of these things that we've turned into more or less consumable services, where you send some text or send an image to a service and it will not only extract text but can also translate it and perhaps even redisplay it on a screen for you. It seemed like a really good idea to be able to open accessibility to these games that I had purchased. What's interesting, there's kind of a limitation here. When I was building the translator tablet, the extraction of text only works on English at this time. So it is a preview technology from Microsoft, so it can extract English text from really any game. And we've got this very, very seasoned offering that goes along with it that allows you to do translations. So if you have the text, you can perform translations on it. It's up to 64 different languages, including Klingon, Japanese, if you will. So I looked at this technology that could kind of give you the solution. Wouldn't solve my problem. I'd love to play the Japanese games, but it does allow you to translate any game from English to any language of those 64 languages that it supports.
You have the need of a Babel fish from Hitchhiker's Guide, so you decide to build one,
I had the opportunity to actually show this off to the team that created OCR service and the text translation service. And, I got to ask them, hey, when's Japanese support coming? Unfortunately, Chinese will be the next language that comes out. So that is what I was told. I don't know any ETA on that, but even that right there kind of opens up a variety of different games, especially on the classic NES market, that there's really no other way to play them. You'd have to be able to speak Chinese or another foreign language in order to be able to make sense of the content. The majority of the games that were coming out were very text laden. A lot of these games were large scale RPG type of games. So being able to kind of understand what's going on went beyond just pressing a couple buttons like you might do in Mario, where you could figure that out regardless of whether you had a translation. Some of these other games are telling these rich stories, and the only way to really be able to understand what's being conveyed there is to have some sort of a system that can translate what's going on in the game back to you.
So what are some of these games that you would be most excited to get your hands on if we can get this technology working for a Japanese to English text translation?
Oh, wow. Well, I think for starters, I would bet that most people who don't speak Japanese have not covered the PCFX library. So I think you'd have almost an entire game console there. You'd be unlocking 58 or so games that have basically just never been able to be played by other individuals. In addition to some really sought after titles, things like the third entry for Earthbound, so Mother 3 for the NES, or even being able to, go back and look at all those Dragon Quest games, of which there's a lot that's lost in translation for the ones that did come over here, and not all of them did come over. And personally, I just have a really high interest in the PC Engine stuff. I mean, this was a game console that The American version sort of tanked over here, but in Japan it was bigger than the Famicom at some point. The PC Engine, believe it or not, and so there's of games on there that just haven't really been seen for what they really are because they haven't been examined under by reviewers that can make sense of those games at this time.
So we talked a lot about the older games from Japan. I was very curious to know because I play a decent amount of JRPGs myself. One of the more recent ones in the last couple of years being Xenoblade Chronicles 2. And the thing is, I did not much care for the English voice acting in that. And I had a friend who was over. I was showing him the game. He knows a little bit of Japanese, and he's telling me that, the translations are a little finicky, and that generally they just take the English audio for the releases of the games, they put it to text, and they put it on the screen. But the thing is that it doesn't really translate the Japanese spoken language the way that it should, and you kind of wonder if you're going to lose something in these games along the way. And so I wonder if with some of the games that you've translated into other languages, if you speak other languages yourself, or if you know anybody who does, where you've kind of checked to see, like, how good is this? Is it translating the way that it's supposed to be? Is it just kind of a rough translation? Like, how's it going so far with that?
So I did have the opportunity to bring this device to Build, which is like the largest Microsoft developer conference. It's held once a year. And while I was there, we had a guy come up from the Ukraine who spoke a little bit of Russian, and we were translating Tetris. He said that is right. He said that is a perfect translation. If you're thinking about like the layout of where it'll say lines and score and all that sort of thing, he said it was perfect. I had another gentleman who was watching a translation of The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, and we were translating it to Japanese, and he mentioned that it was pretty good for a machine translation. He said it's not exactly saying what the English is, but it's getting most of the way there. So we were actually translating Zelda from English to Japanese, and it was good enough. And from what I've heard, just Japanese is a very complex language. I don't even know where to start with it, so I couldn't speak to that. But I did find it interesting that it seemed like we were getting some of the way there, and it was just an interesting tables kind of turn of here I am, this English speaking only gamer that would just love to be able to unlock all these Japanese titles, and here's this guy standing in front of me and are now available to him, and I just thought that's really cool. I could potentially be giving someone else something that they could find useful that was kind of born out of trying to solve my problem, but now it's kind of solving everyone else's, and I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, and full disclosure, we may have people who are just like, no, it doesn't work for English, and we'll immediately click out, but it's exciting prospect for new technology, and not only will it not, there's future potential for American audiences, but there's a lot of non-English speaking audiences who would love to play a lot of the English translated retro library. There's a lot of people there's not a lot of Russian translations of retro games, so there is a hugely exciting possibility for that.
I just think about even translating the Spanish, just how wide you could get an audience on some of these English games, and that's the thing is you start to look at the problem a little bit differently, and you realize, we have some titles here too that never made it anywhere else, and being able to kind of share that and hold the keys to that as well, and unlock it with technology is just a really, really powerful type of thing to consider. If you look at the overall problem that's being solved here, we're extracting text from the game, doing a live translation, and replacing it. It's interesting to see where that might go in the future in terms of like being able to live stream perhaps television shows or foreign news channels and things like that, and potentially even in real time as technology gets even more powerful.
Have you always wanted to know how stressful American news channels are? Now you can in any language.
Oh my goodness. Open up a can of worms there.
Say there's a can of worms, yes, that could be open with this, yeah.
So you mentioned Mother 3 briefly before, so I just have a quick question about that. How many people have you asked about working on a Mother 3 project so far?
I've not. It's funny though. I have been Yeah, I feel so bad being on this Nintendo podcast and talking about PC Engine left and right, but have
We're
been
here
playing.
to talk nerdy love across the board.
They use the same processor, believe it or not, the NES and it's a modified processor. So we're close. But the what's interesting, I've been playing this American translation of Ys 4. So this is Ys is a really popular title overseas. It's made some US releases. I know the PlayStation Portable had some translated versions, officially translated. This game apparently was so good at its time that a bunch of people got together to build up this translation of the game, where they went so far as even doing the AD PCM audio that PC Engine gets used for voiceover. They actually re-recorded all of the sound and audio to be in English, and then went through the game and translated all the text from Japanese to English, and almost in this source/community type of effort, recreated the game from scratch. And these things take time. That's the big problem. While it's an awesome rendition, having something like a machine translation on hand, while it won't be as good, it'll never be as good as what I'm seeing in this Ys 4 translation, could at least get us most of the way there without necessarily taking as much time. And I think that that's really useful because, again, there's probably a lot of sleeper hits out there that just haven't been stumbled across yet. I like to think that there's still stuff out there to be discovered, personally.
I think that's always the case. I think that for anyone to think that they played every game ever is a little bit of a stretch. You could play lots of games, but oh man, I think that the amount of content out there is almost limitless.
I mean, have you played Booger Man 2? There's still
I've
stuff
never
to
even
play.
heard of Booger Man 2 until today.
I don't even know if there's a second one. I know there's a first one, and that's bad enough, you know?
It's a pick and flick adventure. From what...
Oh my goodness.
Yes, someone else remembers Booger
That's its
Man.
tagline.
I want to say, it's so cool there's a common platform like GitHub for people to share projects like this if anyone wanted to make this themselves. I mean, neither Mac or I are engineers, we're just humble nerds. So can you share a bit about why you like GitHub and why it's a good platform for engineers to familiarize themselves with?
Well, GitHub is amazing because the code becomes part of a social platform, whereas before, code was always this thing that was kind of, something you downloaded from someone's website. Occasionally it included source code to go along with it, and the direction of it might have been driven in these chat rooms that you may or may not be invited to. And with GitHub, helped out and helping out. Not all of it. There's definitely ways to do things in private. If you are a corporate entity and you want to build stuff and not have prying eyes, it does support that. But what I find really exciting is that developers that just have these ideas that come up, in their attic or in their basement, expose that code and content to the world, where they can then start to build communities around it. And the amazing thing is, you don't even have to be technical to contribute to these types of projects. For example, just submitting bug reports is often a very, very valuable type of contribution for a developer to know where things are broken. Or even being able to have someone that can write documentation, I think, is extremely powerful. In fact, I would argue to say that the best written code, not better than the best written documentation. I mean, hands down, best written documentation beats it every time. So I think it's really interesting that we have this platform that not only lets you share what you have, kind of exposes it out to the masses, but also lets everybody who has access to it be able to potentially contribute.
Thank goodness for the advent of the internet. It really just it opens up so many doors for collaboration between people.
I mean, that is truly how this show came to be. We're recording this across international lines.
The amount of kilometers or miles for the Americans out there that stand between the three of us right now is quite a bit. So
where is everyone recording from? I'm curious now.
Oh, well, we here are recording in foggy San Francisco.
And I'm currently in Winnipeg, but give me a couple of weeks and I will be recording live from Edmonton instead.
Oh, nice. I'm down here in hot Houston, Texas.
Oh, we
Yeah,
really
we've got a
are
nice
very
little
far
triangle
apart
going on
right
here.
now.
So all these projects seem like you continue the conversation around retro gaming, and as you showed us in pre-interview, you've quite the retro home setup. It's really something to be envied. Have you always had a lifelong love for retro games, or did you just never move off of the Super Nintendo?
The short answer is yes. I always had a love for games. There was a time when I got rid of my collection. Oh,
Oh no.
yeah,
I bet that
and this was
really
like,
hurts nowadays.
yeah, it's some of those I'm never going to get back. We'll just say that because just the prices on some of these things, which I think is
All right, tell us
interesting to
what's a holy
see.
grail you lost?
But one I can easily think of is EVO for the Super Nintendo. I mean, just,
No.
yeah, it's long gone. I had a boxed TurboGrafx 16 with about 25 games, 4 controllers. I mean, I could get it back. Is it worth it? I don't know.
Were
I
you
mean,
just kind of at a point in your life, like when you got rid of these things that you thought, oh, like I don't really need these, or they don't really speak to me anymore, or did they get lost?
That's kind of funny. I think I was in college at the time, and I just started thinking, like I guess I'm supposed to grow up or something, so I'm gonna shed these things, and I'm sure that'll make me more of an eligible bachelor or something like that. I think was the thoughts going through my head at the time, and all of that is wrong. I just want to tell anybody who's listening to this podcast, learn from a mistake here. One, if you I found out I really liked video games because I got back into them, so that's one good thing. But if you like something, like it, it's cool. As I've gotten older, I've just found that embracing that even more in a lot of ways has kind of helped my career, and it's helped a lot of the projects I've built, and it keeps me just as happy as it did when I liked those things many years ago when they were actually out and on store shelves. So
It's funny because you know what, years ago, like middle school or even into high school, you get made fun of for being a nerd or being a gamer, or because people are moving on to other things bigger or better in their minds or the others. And it's funny because nerdiness has come back in such a way now that it's like it's on trend, right? Like you look at the amount of people that are going to these conventions and who are talking about video games online and working on projects like the things that you're doing right now. And yeah, it's unfortunate because I went through a similar time as you. I got rid of some of the games that I had that now I just don't think that I'm ever going to see again because, I kind of felt the same way when I was in college. It was like, yeah, maybe I shouldn't be playing as many games as I do and all this kind of stuff. But then you find out when you get to be an adult and you're done school and you have a little bit more disposable time, you have more disposable time to go back into these things that you love, whether it be current generation gaming or gaming from 20 years ago.
I absolutely agree with that sentiment. And then the other thing too, if you're making more money as an adult than you were as a teenager, that's the other part that kind of opens up the floodgates on this too, right? Is you can have anything you want. You just got to be willing to pay the price for it these days.
RIP my bank account because of the amiibo collection that I have amassed. They're like Pokemon cards for adults with disposable income. It's terrible.
and that's just the funny thing about all this too. I don't know if this is a real thing that happened or just my experience, but I swear, you're talking about this resurgence of nerdiness. I don't remember tech and nerdy stuff in general being nearly as cool as it is today. Like, you go to the mall now and there's Think Geek stores that are selling, caricatures of Mega Man and Link and stuff like that. If those would have been on store shelves as an item that I could have procured 15 years ago.
Hey, I remember Babbage's being where it was at. If anyone else remembers that store before Electronics Boutique bought them out, that was a very tight store.
What I'm saying?
Very much
You can
dating
buy
myself.
anything now. Even Babbage's, I know it's like primarily games, but like you can buy like a Mario backpack or a lunchbox if you want at Walmart right now.
Yes, the invasion of video games into being more pervasive into all aspects of our pop culture. It's on backpacks, it's on T-shirts, it's
But
it's leaning into what we love, and a lot of these kids have grown up with now parents who spent their whole lives playing Nintendo and doing what they love. Like I have lots of people around my age who have kids and they play games, so they've only known that video games are cool because my dad plays them.
It's funny because when I was growing up, I grew up with parents who didn't play video games. Actually, funnily enough, my dad played and beat Super Mario 64, which I still think is quite impressive for someone who never played games before. But I remember my brother and I handing my mother an N64 controller to play some Mario Kart, and she's whipping it left and right, hoping that it's going to help her turn. But now we live in a world where, you're right, like a lot of parents grew up playing video games, and it's not as easy to just sit there, like, it's easier to sit down and connect with your kids over these things. Whereas I think 25 or 30 years ago, it really wasn't, because this was technology that was new at the time, and a lot of the adults or parents at the time didn't grow up with it, and it kind of came a bit late for them, I think. My parents never really got into it after that.
And I think you're spot on with that. And, something to be said, too, about perhaps the age of video games our parents grew up in, right? That was where the box art would kind of oversell you, and you'd get these lackluster experiences. Talking about Atari, but sometimes I wonder if people felt jaded about that, because my dad's always like, I don't know why you want to play this stuff. It's not even there's not that much going. Oh, Dad, it's changed. It's like controlling a movie now sometimes. So it's funny.
Well, and the lore that's been created in some of this stuff has existed for decades now. You look at games like Zelda or Final Fantasy and all these kind of things, and you get trilogies like Star Wars and stuff where you get 3 movies now and again, and the lore is created through books and all that. But video games have become this whole other medium to provide you with like stories that you could follow for forever, it seems.
When you look at how Nintendo does it too, I mean, the cross collaboration, in games like Smash and really anything, you could feature 2 characters, Mario and Raving Rabbids, right? Like the way that they combine everything, it's almost like, I don't know, it's just always a way to find Nintendo characters in Nintendo first party titles, and I just love that. Like you said, it creates this kind of lore, almost like what you'd see, or expect in Marvel comics, right, where you see the team ups and the things like that. It just never stops.
Well, and I don't know if either of you got into any video game, video games or franchises that really meant a lot to you, but it's, I look further for even more information. Like when it came out, I bought that Hyrule Historia book. I'm hoping to get the Masterworks and all of that eventually, just because I like this stuff. I like to know more. And sometimes with the Zelda games, Nintendo doesn't provide as much information as the games as you want, and so you have to look to these other sources to find out, okay, this is why this is this way. And I think that's really cool.
It's funny. I'm reminded now of where was I in, like a Buckle or something like that? One of those stores, Urban Outfitters, I think it was, and they were selling the Zelda Hyrule art book. And I'm just like, what does this world come to? Right, you go in a clothing store for kids, and now there's Nintendo books everywhere.
A better place. That's what I like to think.
Ah, yes.
There you go.
Does it exist above the good place?
So, finally, who inspires you to create? We like to kind of build our artist family tree here at the Nintendo Nerds. So, in the video game world, or the engineering world, or otherwise, who inspires you?
Gosh, in the engineering world, I've been inspired by a lot of different folks. A lot of unsung heroes, like some of your folks behind RetroArch and LibRetro, which is the reason why you have emulators that are so nice and fancy these days. Some of these are unsung heroes. I mean, I remember when SNES 9X came out, because it was still the 90s, and that's why it had that name. And LibRetro comes out, which, if you're not familiar, is this project that I guess makes a uniform API for how graphics are displayed by emulators and sound and controller input and things like that. And that is the reason why you see things like RetroArch, the emulator front end for LibRetro emulators, play a multitude of different cores, because they all subscribe to this uniform capability. I think the people behind that project were very far ahead of their time, even in the 90s, when they were writing these things in C so that they could be portable later. I don't know if y'all are familiar, but a lot of these things, these emulators, they can run almost anywhere, depending on how they're coded. So like your NES emulators can run on a modified Nintendo Switch or on a Android phone or what have you. And the reason why this is because these developers that were building these things way back in the day realized that for preservation, they would need to target processor architectures. And so while I haven't given you a name, I'd say I think the libretro and RetroArch projects are just stellar in terms of what they've done for preservation of classic games and just making it easy and accessible for people to access those titles if they don't have a physical device on hand to maybe play some of these classic games.
Absolutely. And do you have anything in the pipeline that you're noodling on as far as what's next for this tablet or what's next for you in retro gaming?
You know, I'll throw it back to the folks at RetroArch. I got reached out to on a Reddit thread, I think, when I posted this, and someone said, "You have met all the criteria for this bounty we have right now," or they wanted to implement live translation into RetroArch itself, which utilizing a similar strategy that I'd come across. So it would support any game that RetroArch supports or game console, and so they actually have a bounty and they have an implementation. You might have to be a Patreon donator to get access. I could be totally wrong about that, but they are adding in support for live translation of games using a very similar, albeit different strategy. That's going to be an official feature in RetroArch, and will support all languages, to and from everything.
Very cool.
I think being a part of that, and knowing that I had something to kind of contribute there. They might not ever use a line of my code. I take that back. Building this project actually involved a few pull requests to some RetroArch projects, and I'll be honest, that made my day when I had people like Rob Loach following my GitHub. I'm just, and this is a head maintainer of a lot of the libretro projects. That made my day. I mean, seeing a pull request getting accepted by folks on the libretro team like 4 or 5 or 6 times as a result of some things I had to fix over there to make this work for me was, I don't know, that to me was just the biggest amount of thanks and cred that I think I could have asked for.
That's so great. Well, Paul, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really great to talk to you and get an insight into the mind, into your mind and the way that it works and what you're trying to work on here.
It's been a pleasure. I've never really had the opportunity, I think, to come this transparent with my love for video games. So it's been a real pleasure to have this chat with you guys, and I'd love to do it again sometime.
Wonder if you can tell us how people can connect with you online.
Sure. So on Twitter, I go by PJ Decarlo. I usually produce a lot of things in the Internet of Things type of arena of technology. And on GitHub, I go by Toolbach, Tool B-O-C. It's a handle I guess I coined when I was 12 because Tool and the Blue Oyster Cult were my favorite bands, and that's where that name came from. So if you want to follow
into it,
and it just stuck.
Yeah, so if you want to follow me there, that's where my code goes. So feel free to follow there.
All right, perfect. Well, if people want to, then they can use those links to get in touch with you, and we'll include links to GitHub in the description below.
And we'll be sure to make sure that everyone can get their hands on the information on the retro gaming tablet, and we'll include the video and your demonstration as well. And let us know in the description below what games you've always wanted to play, but you couldn't read the language. If you've enjoyed this video, we'd appreciate the thumbs up, or subscribe for more content like this.
As always, we hope that you leave this video ready to pick up a Pro Controller, a paintbrush, or a pen. I'm Mac Fraser.
I'm Backrolls, and this has been the Nintendo Nerds.